We've got to stop this before it gets out of hand, before it gets to a point where Canadians are going to be frustrated with us because we're all thinking we're always looking for handouts and saying to us the free ride's over. Well, it's not a free ride. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible ride.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Gray, and this is Gray Matter. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Gray Matter. Well, many Canadians are under the misunderstanding, the misapprehension that our First Nations peoples are somehow against the development of natural resource projects in this country. And in fact, the truth is that this is a false impression that's been created by mass media with the participation of government in order to create this impression that the environment is being protected by First Nations people who are against oil and gas development. This is not true, and as we're going to discover today from our guest, there are many First Nations peoples in this country who are, and especially in Western Canada, who are very, very interested in developing oil and gas projects. Here's a few statistics for your consideration. 19 First Nations communities were projected to be positively impacted by the failed Keystone XL pipeline project. Nearly half of the First Nations communities in Alberta are expected to benefit from oil and gas resource development. And the unemployment rate for First Nations peoples in Alberta is 13.9% compared to 8.1% for the rest of the province. So our guest today is Dale Swampy. He's headed up an organization called the National Coalition of Chiefs, who are dedicated to development of oil and gas projects in our province. And in fact, Dale has been engaged in this for the past 20 years. Welcome to the program, Dale. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Dale is he's a member of the Samson Cree Nation in Maskwacis, Alberta. He's a graduate of the University of Alberta with a bachelor's degree in economics. As I mentioned off the top, he's been very involved in the oil and gas industry. And after working over 20 years with his band, he left his position as CEO with Samson Cree Nation to start his own business as an Indigenous relations consultant, working on a variety of projects, including founding an organization that he heads up called the National Coalition of Chiefs. And essentially what he's done, or he's been doing during all of that time, is doing his very best to get these projects built in order to bring jobs and wealth creation to First Nations communities. But of course, he's been sort of swimming against the tide that we talked about. And so we're going to examine that with him today and get some of his thoughts about why that is happening and what some solutions are. So turning to our quotations, as we always do, the first one is from Sitting Bull. Warriors are not what you think of as warriors. The warrior is not someone who fights because no one has the right to take another life. The warrior for us is one who sacrifices himself for the good of others. His task is to take care of the elderly, the defenseless, those who cannot provide for themselves, and above all, the children, the future of humanity. I have a soft spot for Sitting Bull because my late grandmother told me that our ancestors actually fought against and were part of the group that defeated General Custer there. So we have no proof, but that's part of legend. Secondly, from another Lakota Dakota chief, this is Chief Avril Looking Horse from 1954. He said, "Each of us is put here in this time, in this place, to personally decide the future of humankind. Did you think the Creator would create unnecessary people in a time of such terrible danger?" How relevant is that quotation today with what's going on with the globalists? Know that you yourself are essential to this world. Okay, Dale Swampy, thanks for being with us. Dale, where I'd like to start off, perhaps if you wouldn't mind, is maybe telling the audience a little bit about the National Coalition of Chiefs and the work that you're doing.
Yes, we we started from the cancellation of Northern Gateway. We had what we called the Aboriginal Equity Partners, which was a coalition model uh, of 31 communities out of the 40 communities that made up that were in the vicinity of the Northern Gateway pipeline project. And it was a successful relationship because the 31 First Nation communities were actually growing, started with 26, and we anticipated by the time the project was built that we'd have all 40 aligned and supporting the project as well as owning the project, having 33% ownership in the end. So when the project was canceled, we instead of suing the federal government for lost benefits, we moved towards establishing the National Coalition of Chiefs to spread across the nation to governments, to industry, and to First Nations. The coalition model, the regional coalition model, is the model to use in order to get project certainty, to get projects built, to maximize benefits for First Nation people, and to protect the environment, because First Nation people being involved in being the stewards of the land and always being in that location, uh, from time in memoriam. So when we started the program, we really thought we weren't going to get much traction because we thought most of, just like everybody else did, on the media, and the media, capitalized on the environmentalists and so forth. So we thought there would be a lot of opposition from chiefs across this country to join and to support this model, but we haven't found one yet. We believe the majority of the chiefs across this country are concerned more about employment and poverty than they are, about environment, because they believe, and they've been doing it for years and years and years, hundreds of years, protecting the environment because they know how important that is. So we've been pushing the model, and in 2018, we added to our mandate to defeat unreserved poverty, as we feel poverty is the cause for all of the social ills that we experience across this country, whether it's alcohol and drug abuse, teenage suicide, domestic abuse, uh, murder and missing women, racism for that matter. We believe if we focus on defeating unreserved poverty through employment and ownership of major projects, major natural resource projects, that we'll have a chance in order to bring our communities around so that we can participate in the prosperity of this country.
So you talk about raising people out of poverty, and that is so key because one of the clear markers, and you know this, I don't think many people realize this, but one of the clear markers which determines at least the ability or the option or the availability of being risen out of poverty is energy. And in Alberta and in Canada, we're so fortunate to be blessed with these natural resources. And really, when you go to many First Nations communities, sadly, you can see that lack of access to energy, lack of access to things like just water, of access to things like proper roads, schools, things like that. There's clearly been a lot of broken promises. But what the National Coalition of Chiefs that seems to be doing, that's, let's say, somewhat unique as far as I can see, is that you're not going to the government and saying we want, give us money, we want handouts. What you're talking about is meaningful partnerships in order to help First Nation communities develop their own resources, provide that energy, so that there can be human flourishing for all First Nations peoples. So that's somewhat of a unique approach, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it is. I think it's unique in the sense that we don't see a lot of it across this country happening, and I think it's unique in the fact that the industry itself, the natural resource industry, including the oil and gas industry, hasn't really made a concerted effort to join us in partnerships until the last 15 or 20 years, when ESG guidelines became important to both the federal government and industry in order to get projects built. So I think when you say, partnerships are, didn't exist in the past, I think it was both the industry and the government, lack of commitment towards this, and it's also our lack of seeing the opportunity
Hmm.
that's out there. And you see that in Alberta with all of the 14,000 self-identified Indigenous workers in this country in the oil and gas industry, and they're concerned about what's going to happen with this new legislation regarding, you know, the loan guarantee program, and the fact that we've heard that, Jabot is trying to get oil and gas and natural resources off of the
Hmm.
table in terms of applications for First Nations.
Hmm.
And we think that's very prescriptive, telling First Nations what they can and cannot invest in. And I think that's something that's we are battling against. There's a lot of groups, pro-industry groups across this country that are, related to Indigenous peoples and so forth, that are arguing against this. We just wrote an article in the National Post voicing our issues and concerns regarding this as well.
Mm. One other thing that I think has done a disservice to people like you who are trying to get things like pipelines built are the activities of these NGOs, these non-governmental organizations. And I know for you, it's been somewhat frustrating. You've been involved, going back to all the way to, I think, to 2006. I think you've been involved in every major pipeline project that's been proposed in Canada. And even though you've worked very hard, invested a lot of time and energy, you've had a very difficult time seeing any of these sort of bear fruit. You want to talk about that a little bit, why that's happening, why it's so hard to get these projects built in Canada?
Well, it started in 2008 when the environmental non-government agencies started to focus more on oil and gas and the oil sands in Alberta. And they seen an opportunity to capitalize on an impoverished nation, and more so impoverished people, young people who were, feeling disenfranchised by the Canadian society and didn't think they had a future in this society. They were angry and wanted to blame somebody that's, this shouldn't be happening, and why is it happening to me? And then these NGOs come along and say, you've got this treaty right, you've got this inherent right to be able to, you know, act against projects like pipelines and oil sands and so forth. And you can do this by risking your, criminal records and so forth. So it's terrible thing that happens. A lot of young people get involved in this cultish type disinformation that happens with NGOs. Their types of disinformation is incredible. It speaks in absolutes. It doesn't make any sense, but it's something the young people wanted to hear about. They wanted something to fight for, and they felt that protecting the environment was something that they could do, and not realizing that they were going against all the processes and all the opportunities that were in front of them to be able to, get the opportunities to get a decent job and participate in the prosperity of this country. Not realizing that Canadians are, they are good people, and they want us to be able to get out of poverty. And the only way we can do that is to partner with the biggest industry in Canada right now, and that's natural resource industry.
One of the things that the NCC is involved in is development of these natural resource summits. I believe you have them basically twice a year, big events. The most recent ones have been held in Calgary, and the premier was at the last one. I believe Pierre Poilievre was actually attended the last one as well. So obviously there seems to be a lot of interest politically in what you are doing. Have you noticed any improvement or any sort of shift in the approach of government since Danielle Smith became our new premier, or has it been status quo?
Well, I think if you asked the question a year or two ago, I would say that they were very, very standoffish, and they refused to meet with us. They refused to talk to us. Now the Liberal government is, a minority government, had to join with the NDP in order to get a full government. Their popularity is down now. We finally got an answer from one of our letters, one of our dozens of letters that we sent to the Prime Minister. We actually got an email response to one of the emails we sent to as well. This is something that's out of the ordinary. In the past, we had 31 chiefs who wrote to the prime minister to meet with them on Northern Gateway so that so that they could tell them that they were in support of this project and they were satisfied with the safety and integrity programs that Northern Gateway was offering in order to protect the lands and waters. And we never received a response from the prime minister. And we tried and tried. We went to Ottawa almost 5 times during that time before the project was canceled to express our opinions. We couldn't meet with the prime minister. We couldn't even meet with the natural resource minister. We went to hearings for C-48 tanker ban, C-69, the Canadian energy regulatory regime. That type of involvement has created kind of an animosity, I think, towards us by the current government. But now, since they, are floundering, they're not popular at all. They've ruined a lot of opportunities for us in this country since the 8 years they've been in office. Hundreds of thousands of people in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC have lost their jobs. Billions of dollars worth of projects have been delayed or put on the shelf because of this government. The economy is, turning backwards on us. We need to capitalize on what's going on right now. The price of oil and gas has gone up. We should be in a oil and gas boom right now in Alberta and Saskatchewan and BC and Manitoba, but we're not because we're held back by these ENGOs and a leader who was part of it all. Our environmental minister Jabot is right front and center,
Mm-hmm.
doing something that he's always done, and that is trying to pass things without any compromise at all, without
Yeah.
any sustainable action. That means no sustainable process for this energy transition.
Mm-hmm.
Comes to mind when he starts to promote what he's trying to do, and what that creates is a issue with Canadians because Jabot and Trudeau are from a different sector of our society, and everybody forgets that we are in a cold environment. We're one of the few centers of population that is so far up north that we experience 30, 40 degrees below zero all the time. And Canadians have become good people because they know the struggles each one of us has in being able to handle the low temperatures and so forth, and the remoteness and so forth. So Canadians have been, in my mind, are the best people in the world,
I
and they try
agree.
to help each other. Now we're getting in a situation where we think we can go ahead and stop the heating oils, stop the fossil fuel use of fossil fuels by, imposing an incredible carbon tax. 60% of our people, are unemployed on welfare. Where are they going to get the money to be able to employ to heat their own homes?
Right.
We have people on reserves with 2 or 3 families living in one house, not because there's a lack of housing, but because there's a lack of ability to pay the kind of utilities you need to pay when you're living in a remote
Yeah.
community. And that's something that the Canadian people just are not really, you know,
That's an
they
untold
don't really
story.
understand. They don't
Yeah.
really appreciate
Mm-hmm.
because there's no information out there being given to them about what our situation is. And if they knew the kind of situation we were in, they'd roll up their sleeves and help us.
Yeah.
All you got to do is look at my sister having a soup kitchen on the reserve. She has 20 volunteers that come out from off the reserve. If those volunteers and what they know about First Nation communities and what they know about the strife that we are going through right now, if every Canadian knew and understood like they did, we wouldn't have the poverty we have today.
Right. That's truth and reconciliation right there, isn't it?
That's right.
I saw Mr. Jabot tweet today. Actually, he's saying that the destruction of the oil and gas industry in Canada is necessary for the greater good, and he also thinks it's very important to increase access to MAID, medical assistance in dying. I think we can connect those dots. At least that's in his mind. He sees the opposite of human flourishing. It seems to be what he wants for our country. You mentioned that op-ed that you published in the National Post. What specifically was the message that you sent to Mr. Jabot through that piece?
Well, we focus more on the idea of getting the federal loan guarantee program to make sure that it includes the natural resource industry, the oil and gas industry, because we think that's important. The biggest projects that are going to be coming up in the next 10 years are going to be related to that. We also want to support Pathways Alliance and carbon sequestration. We think that's going to have a big impact on our ability to make net zero by 2050. So it's those type of things that we want to be involved in. We think the carbon sequestration program and the other projects associated with Pathways Alliance is going to be the biggest construction project in the history of Canada. It's going to be like building another, another industry. And our First Nations, the 25 communities that are involved and located within the region of operations of those projects, want to be a part of it. And the Pathways Alliance group, which is comprised of the 6 big oil sands producers, which produce something like 95 or 96% of all of the oil sands production in Alberta, are behind this and want to work to help with climate change. And we know that the transition has to include fossil fuels until such point in time that we're able to develop a sustainable green energy system. And that's not going to happen in the next 10 or 20 years. So we have to rely on the oil sands. We have to rely on the oil and gas industry. We have to rely on a natural gas industry. We have to rely on LNG and so forth. And First Nations are seeing the opportunity and seeing the cooperation of both industry and the provinces. So we want to capitalize on this and get our people, our young people, to say, hey, look, we care about you and we want you to be employed, and here are the opportunities that we are working towards to get you employed and to participate as Canadian citizens, hardworking Canadian citizens. And it's not out of the question. It happened with Fort McKay. They're 100% employed.
What a success
and they're only 100%
there.
employed because the government, the province, the oil sands developers gave them extra consideration and worked with them. It took a while. It took 50 years, but that's it's not something that we should give up on. Don't give up on our people, because we think we can get them out of poverty. And that's not just the young people. I'm talking about the 20, 30, 40-year-old individuals that are wallowing in poverty on our reserves, that are collecting social welfare payments every month. They don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. We can't give up on those people, because even if we invest all of our money in education, and what did Trudeau do? He funded $700 or $800 million for education on reserves, but it's not going to help us if our parents are not getting up to get our children to school.
Right.
And that's what we need. We got to get rid of this vicious cycle, this social welfare cycle that's going on right now. And in the article, I pointed out that the federal government's got to stop managing poverty and start managing things like extra consideration on employment strategies, extra consideration on ownership of projects. Because once we have ownership, it's not, we'll do our best to hire your First Nation people. All of a sudden, we're on the board, right?
Right.
All of a sudden, we're on a board, we're protecting the environment, and we're making sure that we get employment opportunities, and that's important.
Right. So you're not talking about affirmative action, you're talking about action. You're talking about economic action and sort of building the the confidence and self-esteem of First Nations peoples and communities. I want to talk a little bit about the whole sovereignty thing. Now, as you know, First Nations communities have been talking about sovereignty and self-governance for a really long time in this country. But most recently, this whole sovereignty issue has come to light in terms of the province and the federal government. And this province, Alberta and Saskatchewan, have both passed statutes, essentially sovereignty-type legislation. Is that a concern to you and to the NCC in terms of your ongoing relationships with the federal government, or is that something that you see as more a situation where Alberta and Saskatchewan are operating within their lanes and it really doesn't impact any of the projects and things that you're working on?
Well, we support what Alberta and Saskatchewan are doing to defend their province's economy, defend their ability to make decisions about natural resources that lie within their provinces. And we think that it mirrors exactly what First Nations are trying to do, and First Nations are trying to be able to get their own sovereignty so that they can manage their communities the way they want. We promote the coalition model to advance on infrastructure deals such as fresh water, wastewater, solid waste systems, roads and bridges, power utilities, housing, and so forth. The coalition model, we think, is the model to use to get regional communities together to be able to manage this. Self-government is a process that we feel chief and councils want to be able to get moving so that they can understand and do, and make strategies for their to better provide services to their community members in a way that fits to where they're located, where the resources are, where industry is, where the economy is, and so forth. And it's because we don't believe one size fits all.
Mm-hmm.
And the federal government's always been promoting programs and things that they think that they can help us to get out of poverty, but not realizing that one size doesn't fit all. You've got to be able to go out and visit with the communities and ask the chief and councils, ask the band managers what's important for their community. And it's not the same across the board for every community, just like it isn't the same for province to province. So to say that national energy program should be equal across the all of the 10 provinces, 3 territories is ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense at all. And to be able to have provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan obey that kind of ridiculous program is, just ridiculous. And I think if the, we've always pointed out, and I thought Kenny at one time was going to be able to, make a strong effort to protect our natural resources in this province. But as soon as, he got into power, he changed the name of the War Room to the Canadian Energy Center. I knew right away we weren't going to get the kind of effort from him that we needed to protect our natural resources. Now we have someone in there who knows all the issues, who's worked with all the issues, and that we know and trust very well. And she's working hard to protect our communities, and Saskatchewan's doing the same thing. Manitoba getting their first Indigenous person as a
Mm-hmm.
premier is something that we're looking forward to. He's going to see that a lot of the First Nations want opportunities, want economic opportunities, and those are going to come from the natural resources. So we applaud what they're doing, and we support them in any way we can, and we hope that they're going to be able to get in a situation
Mm-hmm.
where we're going to move forward with natural resource
Mm-hmm.
development, including oil and gas.
You mentioned the new Premier Manitoba, Wab Kinew. I agree with you. That's a very promising situation. Are you concerned at all? I noticed he came out in support of abolition of the carbon tax. But are you concerned at all that being part of the NDP, that perhaps his party might not be receptive to oil and gas development?
Yeah, this whole party alignment is something that I've always opposed ever since I became a advocate for democracy and so forth as a young person growing up. The democratic model has always preached that we go out and elect officials to make decisions on our behalf. We go out and elect officials to become more informed about the issues that's are concerning to how we live and how we operate within this society. And the only reason we do that is because we don't have the time to get on top of all the issues.
Right.
We elect people to do that, and we want those people to look at both sides of the issue and make an informed decision. We don't we didn't elect people to obey a leader, a prime minister, or a party, and if they don't obey, they're going to get kicked out of the party. It just doesn't make sense. I mean, in the 60s and 70s, when I was growing up, there wasn't such a division between party lines, and now you're seeing a lot of liberals who see a lot of good things that conservatives are doing. You see a lot of conservatives seeing a lot of good things that liberals are good. I mean, the liberal and the conservative models aren't all perfect.
Right.
They need a little bit of both.
Right.
And to say that, I hope that Wab is able to get into a situation where he's making decisions that are based on his own opinions and his opinions as a First Nation person too, as well, and as a protector of our environment, as a promoter of getting us out of poverty, as a promoter of economic development of First Nations. And when you see that kind of work, you're going to see a cross section of both what the NDP wants, the Conservatives want, and the Liberals want. And I hope he makes independent choices that are good for, both Manitoba, the Indigenous people, and Canada.
Yeah.
And Canada.
Yeah, me too. Another sort of enemy, if you will, of oil and gas development in this country has been the courts. But we had a couple of recent decisions that show a little bit of promise. The C-69 No More Pipelines bill was set aside, or that was decided in favor of the provinces. And then we had this recent decision on plastics, the unconstitutionality of Mr. Gibault's blanket plastic ban, which always seemed ludicrous to any sensible person. Do you see the prospect? Are you optimistic that that is going to open up the opportunity or the corridor to have some of these major projects that you've tried to get done over the past couple of decades, that they'll finally get going, or are you concerned that perhaps these will still be stalled by future litigation?
Well, we always want the Constitution to be a common sense legislation. And I think what's happened in the last two decisions and more decisions to come is that Supreme Court has supported the Constitution and has made decisions that relate to common sense factors. And that means that, um, doing the kind of programs or promoting the kind of programs and processes that are proposed by ENGOs, which are non-sustainable, non-compromising, that speak in absolutes, doesn't work with society.
Mm-hmm.
You can't say everybody across this country's got to do this because we believe it's for the good, no matter who you are, or where you live in, or what type of lifestyle you have. Doesn't make sense for anybody. And I think the Americans got it right. The states have a lot of authority over everything that they do for their people, are not dominated by the federal government in terms of what goes on in their neck of the woods, so to speak. And I think the country's got to realize that we got to get away from these idealistic notions that things can happen in an instant. And people have got to stop electing politicians who want to who want to live in immortality by passing these ideological processes that will never work in real
Right.
life and real
Mm-hmm.
society. And we've got to start looking at the pragmatic view and the sustainability view of what Canadians can endure. And until we get that, we're not going to be able to get a society or an economy that's going to be able to come out from what's been created in the last 8 years.
Dale, the NCC and chiefly yourself as its leader have been very outspoken in a number of articles that you've published about opposing these emission caps that the federal government wants to impose. But the other side of that, and I'm interested to get your take on this because it's an area that I don't fully understand, it's the whole concept of carbon capture and methane capture. This seems to be, pardon the pun, sort of an untapped resource. And there's some very interesting dialogue going on about this. Is this something that the National Coalition of Chiefs is involved in, developing carbon capture type programs? Because it seems to me that this could be a tremendous opportunity for First Nations to get involved and to build the kind of wealth that you're talking about in their communities.
Yeah, exactly. We want to lead the environmental protection regime in Canada. And the only reason we want to do this is because we have to communicate to Canadians and federal provincial governments the reality that we aren't going to we're not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
The giant mine in Northwest Territories the Canadian taxpayer now has to pay $4.2 billion in reclamations in order to protect the environment, protect the lives of the people, protect our fresh water from the arsenic that's been created from this mine operating for 40 years without any real environmental protection plan or any fund that was created by the proponents to ensure that there was going to be at the end of the road a plan to clean up the environment. And had they been in partnership with the First Nations, chances are that project probably wouldn't even be built with the amount of um, um, damage that this whole process has created. I mean, this thing's going to take 20 years to implement, and they're going to freeze the arsenic underground, and there's nothing else you can do but monitor it for the next 100 years or next few 100 years until there's a technological process that allows us to get rid of that deadly product. So you take that into context and you talk about the processes that are created right now in order to help fight climate change, global warming, and so forth. And one of the categories that comes into it is created by what we call the sustainable energy model, which has to include oil and gas and fossil fuels. And if it has to include fossil fuels, which we believe, then we got to develop processes to allow us to capture that carbon released from those processes and put them in the ground and from literally from where they came, because there's a lot of resources in this country, especially in northern Alberta, to be able to do this. And the technology is there. And who better to handle the technology than the most technologically advanced industry in the world, and that's the Alberta oil and gas industry. And who better to manage it than the stewards of the land? That's the First Nations, who are going to be here, forever. And we want to be sure that 50 years from now, 60 years from now, that that the whole environment is still clean, and that there's no, great mistake or great problem created like we have in the giant mine. There's two more mines in Yukon that are going to go under the same process. I mean, why do we do this? Why do we proceed with things without, realizing that there's no final solution in the end, praying and hoping there's a technology created in the end that'll help us to get rid of these? It's like the nuclear situation, right?
Right.
Why do we create the nuclear situation until we found a technology to get rid of the plutonium that's created from it? So, and First Nations are pragmatic about this. They don't, sweep it under the rug like a lot of the industry proponents do. We've been struggling with proponents for decades, trying to get them to make sure the environment is protected, and we've earned our right to be stewards of the land. And the NGOs have got to stop focusing on killing the economy and start focusing on protecting the economy. And they called us stewards of the land. That's what they've been promoting for us for the last 2 decades. So we want to call them out on it and say to them, well, if we are stewards of the land, you got to help us to protect the environment, and we have to be owners of these projects. We have to be, controlling the environmental protection strategies and programs like CCUS and carbon capture sequestration programs. And we think we can do it because we want to do it, and we want to do it for the decades it takes for us to be able to get that program going and to be able to meet the net zero goals for 2050.
You mentioned First Nations historically being stewards of the land. But it seems to me, and I mentioned this off the top of the show, that First Nations people have been unfairly branded as being anti-resource development. And the NGOs have played a huge part in this. Why do you think that has occurred? And is that a situation where, for example, the NGOs have sort of weaponized First Nations people in order to be a roadblock that would prevent, for example, pipeline projects and so on? Why are First Nations being sort of portrayed publicly as being against oil and gas? Because clearly, from the statistics that I found on your website that I read off the top of the show, I mean, about half of the First Nations communities in Alberta will benefit from oil and gas projects. So clearly, they're for this. But why is this perception out there in the public that the opposite is true? Is that concerning to you?
Oh, definitely is. I mean, it's always the loudest voice seems to get all the media coverage. Media has turned the
But it is
far
false. It
left.
is false, isn't it? I mean, you're steeped in this. That's really not what First Nations communities, by and large, in your experience, want. They want to develop this energy and create wealth, right?
Yeah, I've never talked to a First Nation leader who said after we've told them that we think it's a good idea to proceed with this project X because it's going to provide you with employment and training and prosperity. And I've never seen them turn around and say, well, we believe it's going to be toxic to the environment and that the people that are doing this are not going to protect us and the land and the water. We know that all you got to do is look at the LNG projects coming up in northwestern and southwestern BC. The First Nations out there have been working for decades with oil and gas. We were there starting the Northern Gateway project as early as 2000. And although they were greenfield and they didn't have experience with bitumen or oil, they had a lot of experience with gas. The LNG, assets out there, the natural gas assets are tremendous, and especially in northeastern BC. And we've seen them working with proponents, and these are Canadians. These are fellow Canadians. Canadians aren't going to go out there and ruin their country on purpose, and they work in the best manner they can. They spend as much resources on integrity issues, integrity programs in order to protect the environment, and they do it the best in the world. And it's the First Nations in that area that understand and appreciate that, and that's why they support them because they know they're not going to they're not going to ignore them. They're not going to they're there in the community. They're working with them, and we believe that the majority of First Nations across this country have the same kind of attitude. The only reason that we get the kind of opposition that we get is because industry in the past has ignored First Nations.
Mm.
We believe the coalition model works well because it includes all of the First Nations, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're big or small, whether they close or far from the proximity of the project, are included and have an equal voice in what goes on within that area of operations. And I think that's important. And once you get that and get that understanding between the two, but between the three, I guess, entities, the government, industry, and First Nations, then you can get a cooperative agreement, and then you can get some level of certainty to the First Nation leaders that this project's going to protect the environment. If you don't get that, then the chances are that First Nation leader has no understanding of what that project's all about, so we'll automatically oppose it. It's just a human trait.
Right.
Something if you don't understand, you tend to push it away. And there's not a whole lot of chiefs going up front and center and manning picket lines and so forth because they know that's not going to help them get their people out of poverty. It's not going to help them get them jobs. Every day, every chief that I ever met, every day, he's got people across his desk. He or she has people across their desk asking, "Where can I get a job, chief? Where can I help my family get more, the food
Mm-hmm.
they need, the clothing they need, the heat and utilities in their household. How can you get them to house us? And that's not going to come from manning picket lines on pipeline protests.
Right.
They got to be out there and taking advantage of industry and projects that are operating within their region.
Mm-hmm. And part of that role, sort of connecting these three parts, if you will, that is industry, First Nations communities, and government, are the summits that you put on. And you've got one coming up, I believe, is in February.
Yes,
Is
we
that,
have
do
our
you want to talk about
clean
that?
energy.
Yeah, you want to talk about that a little bit and how that works? Because I know you bring a lot of industry leaders together, and there is opportunity for people who are watching this or taking this in to get involved in this and register and have a booth there or to sponsor. You want to talk about your energy summits and sort of how they fit into with the whole ethos of the work that you're doing with NCC?
Yeah, definitely. We started with our natural our energy natural resource summit in June in cooperation with the Global Energy Show. Um, and then about 2 years ago, the chiefs got together and they said, well, we have to do something with the renewable projects because we want to be part of the renewable projects coming up. And they knew that there was a lot of projects being developed across the country. So we went out and did research with the unions about where are the renewable projects in this country. We thought we'd have a conference either in Vancouver or in Toronto because we thought that, those are areas where the environmentalists are focused on. And what we found was incredible. I mean, 146 renewable projects on the book in Alberta alone. That's more than double all of the other provinces combined. So we didn't have to move our conference just because it was a clean energy summit. And we host it in Calgary, and we get uh, proponents from all over North America promoting their renewable energy concepts and projects and so forth. And we developed what we call the National First Nation Electricians Program, which is an apprenticeship program that's going to work in line with the renewable projects, which we know is going to require a lot of electricians, electrical engineers, linemen, and so forth. So we want to hit the ground running when that renewable industry gets off the ground and starts becoming a big factor within the society. And so that's what we did. We host in February our first conference, which is a Clean Energy Summit. We were in our first conference last year, where we were privileged to have Pierre Polyev join us and talk about the things that he wants to be able to do and support in Western Canada and with the First Nations and Indigenous inclusion in the society was important to him. And he talked about his program for sharing in the wealth of natural resources. And we promoted to him the 5 conditions that we laid out in the hearings for the UNDRIP legislation, as well as the FPIC legislation, the free, prior, and informed consent, which includes a clause to include within that legislation something concrete like making sure that we become equity owners in all projects relating to natural resource industry. And we
Yeah.
should be. There are First Nations across this country that are suing the federal government, wanting to get uh, benefits from the past 150 years that this country has gotten from natural resource development, and in the future getting a portion of the royalties. We don't think that's a good idea. We think what's a good idea is for us to be able to own part of everything that's going on.
Right.
Because once we have skin in the game, then we not only are on these boards and can determine their direction and future, but we can make sure that our people are employed. We can make sure that the environment is protected, and we can make sure, that the industry itself is maintained in such a manner that goes along align with reducing the effects of
Right.
climate change.
Hence the coalition model. You don't want to go to war with government, with industry. You want to work with them towards common goals, where it was sort of a
That's right.
win-win type of situation, which unfortunately is not is not prevalent enough, unfortunately, at the moment. So I applaud you for that. Do you know if Mr. Polyev is going to come back this February?
I think so. I think
Great.
he'll come out. We're meeting with him when we're in Ottawa next month.
Dale, based on what you've seen and heard from Mr. Poilievre, do you have confidence that if he formed the next government, that the situation would change in terms of getting some of these projects going and developing resources and forming the types of partnerships that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I believe, and I've talked to him several times, and I believe he's committed to making sure that Indigenous inclusion is a top priority in developing this economy. And I think the Canadian people will be behind it because they have seen, how much influence our First Nation people have over project development, especially now,
Mm-hmm.
since we're being involved a lot more and getting extra consideration for this.
Mm-hmm.
And we should have been involved in the last 150 years. And if we'd have been involved the way the 13 corporations in Alaska have been involved since 1972, the environment and the economy and just the general state of our society would be a lot better.
Mm-hmm. We could have many
And
more success stories like Fort McKay, for example.
that's right.
In fact,
That's right.
I have a friend who's a land developer, Larry Andrews, and he's partnered with his company is partnered with Fort McKay. Now they're building residential developments, off reserve. There's a big development that they're doing in St. Albert, a $700 million development, and of course, a huge portion of the profits from that are going to go right back into the Fort McKay community. And these success stories are very repeatable, aren't they?
Oh, definitely. I mean, all you got to look is at Squamish First Nation and the amount of real estate development they're proposing, they have done in the past and now proposing in the future is just immense.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good for both. It's good for the community. It's good for the city of Vancouver. It's good for the province. It's good for the country.
Mm-hmm. One thing I didn't ask you about, but I'm interested to know your thoughts, Dale. What is your view of UNDRIP? Is that a help or a hindrance to what you and the NCC are trying to do?
Well, we've been involved, as I said earlier, but with the legislative process, good or bad or worthwhile, and I'm not sure. We've been involved in the process for the tanker ban, for example, and
Right.
none of the recommendations, none of the things that we indicated ever got, to the actual legislation itself. But we did participate as much as we can, both in the industry section of the legislation for UNDRIP and the First Nation Indigenous section of the UNDRIP legislation and hearing process. And we developed 5 conditions that we wanted to see UNDRIP enforced. And I think a lot of people have got to realize, and the legislation that was passed at the UN wasn't a one-size-fits-all legislation. It was developed in a manner, a generalization on purpose,
Mm-hmm.
because they knew that if it was going to be incorporated by the countries of the world, that each country would have to amend it to suit their current situation.
Right.
And with us, we wanted to be sure that the ambiguity was taken out of the legislation, and there was more certainty in how projects can move forward with the legislation. And the most important factor of the UNDRIP legislation is FPIC in our mind, the free, prior, and informed consent. We got to be able to define what consultation means.
Mm-hmm.
We got to be able to define who is impacted, and we got to be able to do that in a process that provides us with an ability to be able to get that done. It can't be one size fits all. Consultation on oil and gas initiatives for Fort McKay, it's going to be different from consultations for somebody in Ontario,
Mm-hmm.
for example, on
Right.
oil and gas,
Right.
because they're not privy, and they don't have the information expertise to do that.
Right.
So you got to determine what proper consultation is across the board, specifically from project to project. You have to be able to finalize who is impacted communities and not expand it the way they expanded TMX from 60 communities to 129 communities.
Right.
People that have the pipe going right through the reserve are exhausted by the idea that somebody 300 kilometers away is going to have a right to say how that project operates within their
It's
own
understandable.
territory.
Yeah.
So there has to be something to do that, to provide certainty for industry and investment in this country.
Mm.
And the idea of being able to own part of it has to be incorporated too in the legislation, so that we can get away from arguing for royalties on natural resources and get what we should have been getting in natural resource projects, and that is free and clear interest in
Right.
projects. We don't need free and clear interest 51% of the company. We need, something small like 2, 3, 4, 5, 10%,
Right.
whatever ability the organization and the government can afford. And that ability or that consideration has to be paid for by the federal
Right.
government,
Right.
because the federal government has reaped benefits from natural resources for the last 150 years. They own 95% or 90% of the land in this country. You know,
Yeah.
they can afford it,
Wow.
and who better to give ownership to major projects free and clear than the stewards of the land and the people that are going to be there forever.
Right.
We're not going to leave.
Yeah.
We're not going to say, oh, this project didn't work out, it's going to harm the environment while I'm getting up and moving to the United States. No, we are always there.
Right.
You know, companies come and go, people come and go, but First Nations are always there.
Right.
So it's a vital importance to us. And we think right now the way UNDRIP is written, it's gonna hurt more than it's gonna enhance our ability to be able to get out of poverty and our ability
Mm.
to be included in major projects,
Mm.
because it can be used as a weapon against
Mm.
project development, and that's not good for any country.
That's a very edifying insight. Thank you for that, Dale. This has just been a great hour. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us. I want to mention the website. It's NCC.
www.coalitionofchiefs.ca.
Okay, great. So if people want to find out more about the events that you're putting on and really go into more detail on some of the things you've been talking about, they can go and visit that website. I know I've been there. It's very user friendly. It's a lot of great information there. Many of the articles that you published, and it really gives a broader understanding of really something that's going on in the country. I don't think many Canadians are aware of. I think it's fair to say I think it's being suppressed by the mass media. This whole story of the work that that you folks are doing at the NCC. So this is a part of the show where we wind up with our reading list. I've got a book I'm going to mention. I know you've got some great ones that perhaps you can finish us off with. The one that I'm going to refer to is called Weaving Two Worlds. This is economic reconciliation between Indigenous peoples in the resource sector. This is by Christy Smith and Michael McPhee. And this book talks about a lot of the things that Dale has been explaining about bringing together First Nations communities, giving them a seat at the table that they richly deserve, so that we're actually not in a situation where the federal government or resource oil and gas companies are reaping all the benefits of these resources. And so that the First Nations people, as stewards of the land, as Dale has described, they have a seat at the table, and also so that what's being reaped, the harvest that is being reaped from these resources, is going back to those communities where it's sorely needed, because all Canadians have an interest in reducing poverty. And it's a simple fact that if the most impoverished demographic in our country are First Nations communities. That's a terrible, awful thing to say, but it needs to be said. It needs to be recognized, and something has to be done about it. And I'm so grateful for people like Dale Swampy, who are out there every day trying to change this and really change our country for the better. So Dale, over to you. Would you want to share a book or two with our audience that might enhance their understanding of what you're doing and what you've been talking about today?
Yeah, I was going to share some insight into some of the technological books that have been coming out regarding AI and so forth, and been intrigued by it in the last couple of months or so. But what I began to realize, especially in the last week, was what's been happening on the national front for Canadians and their views of what's going on with First Nations. And it was Malcolm Cadwell in his book, The Outliers, and also his book, The What the Dog Saw, where he had a compilation of articles. One of the articles talks about the the idea at that time of a woman becoming president of the United States and how that might impact the actual rights of women in the country in North America. And the fact that if it did happen, in his opinion, it would have made things worse for women.
Interesting.
And you look at the Liberal government and their process kind of mirrors to what was spoken in that context, and that is that once you get a Liberal government who's willing to do what it can for all the wrongs that have been created by society and the government and racism and so forth to the Indian people, it's one thing to be sympathetic to the cause. It's another to flourish it with funds and free money and managing poverty, doling out contributions to First Nations in the form of checks in a real sustainable model to
Right.
get us out of poverty. And I'm beginning to see that Canadians are getting frustrated by this, and it becomes more prevalent even just today when my article came out, and one of the comments people made is, oh, just another group wanting to get more money.
Right.
But we're not. We're not a group that wants handouts. We are a group that wants to be able to get out of poverty and to employ our people. The 20, 30, 40-year-old people who never had a full-time job in their lives, who feel the government and people have just forgotten about them.
Right.
We got to work on this, and it doesn't require money. All it requires is a commitment from Canadian people, from industry and government, to work on strategies to do this.
Right.
We don't need the checks. We don't need the big checks. We need the commitment from the Canadian people to get us out of poverty.
Mm-hmm.
We got to stop not wanting to learn about Indigenous people. We got to stop, pushing it away and driving around our reserves all the time. We got to be able to go in there and meet people and talk about, how can I give a helping hand. Canadians are the best people in the world. I bet everybody has a associate or relative who's adopted children from third world countries, or who is part of a program to help homelessness and so forth. All you got to do is look in your backyard and go onto the reserve and find out, how can we embrace those people, our people, and bring them into our society and give them what they should have had in the past, and try to repair what's been created, which is a society where it's very, very, very difficult for us to move from a social welfare system, a society of handouts, to a employed lifestyle. We got to be committed to that. And I think we've got to stop this before it gets out of hand, before it gets to a point where Canadians are going to be frustrated with us because we're all thinking we're always looking for handouts and no more commitment towards helping us.
Yeah.
And saying to us the free ride's over. Well, it's not a free ride. It's a terrible, terrible, terrible ride. We got violence, we got domestic abuse, we got drug and alcohol abuse, we got murdered and missing women, we have racism, we have teenage suicide.
Yeah.
There's no free ride. It's a terrible, terrible ride.
Yes. Yes.
And we've got to understand this. And the thing is, the federal government, through all of its good intentions, is ruining our ability to bring Canadians on side to help us to get to solve this problem.
Yeah, that might be the greatest disservice that successive governments have done, and that is to draw a division, to treat First Nations people as the other, as opposed to our brothers, right? That's really what you're talking about. We can all win together. But it takes caring, and it takes action. That's really what the NCC is all about.
Well, Canadians seen it already with the COVID relief program, right?
Yeah.
How hard was it to get those people back to work? Once you get free money and you don't have to work, all of a sudden you don't get it. You're trying to find out another way to get it free.
That's a great insight. Yeah, that's brilliant. No, I hadn't thought of that, Dale.
Welcome to our world,
Well, let's try to create a better world together. How about that? Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dale. It's been our pleasure talking with you. You're just a brilliant mind. And I'm sure that anybody who's watched this or listened to this is going to come away with a different understanding of not just of what's going on in our economy and energy, but also really the basic relationships between First Nations peoples and their brothers, the rest of Canadians, brothers and sisters, the rest of Canada. So thank you so much for sharing this time. It's been our great pleasure to have you as our special guest today on Grey Matter.
Thanks for having me.